What's really the difference between comics and manga? People love to talk about these two like they live in completely different worlds, but they actually share a lot more in common than you might think. In fact, a bunch of comic book artists are inspired by anime and manga, and plenty of manga artists have worked for major comic book companies like Marvel and DC. At the same time, obviously there's some differences between the two, and those differences have led to two unique experiences. So as someone who reads a ton of manga but also visits comic book stores on a regular basis, I'd like to compare the comic book and manga industries, discuss the many characteristics that make them so similar, but also find out what actually separates these two styles of stories. To start off the discussion, I do have a couple of quick disclaimers. First of all, when I say comics and manga, that's a pretty big generalization, because obviously there's manga-like stories outside of Japan, and not all comics come from the US. And when we're talking about comics, people like to use comics and graphic novels interchangeably. So what am I talking about? For the purposes of this video, comics will refer to any comic book or graphic novel made in the West, but will mostly focus on the major companies in the US like Marvel and DC. Manga will refer to that same medium, except only those stories that are originally made in Japan or in Japanese style. For example, with a series like Radiant, even though it's made by a French artist in France, it's read right to left and has a manga-like art style. So while you could argue it's really just a French graphic novel, it's clearly a French manga because it looks and reads like manga. And I guess that sort of brings us back to our question of what the heck is even the difference. Now obviously art style is a big difference between the two, because if I show you a page from Invincible and then I show you a page from My Hero Academia, you can probably guess which one is a comic and which one is manga. But there's a lot more that goes in today's market besides art styles, so I'm gonna save that part of the discussion for later in the video. Before that, I'd actually like to start by talking about the different inspirations and training for artists in the East versus the West. First of all, manga artists and comic book artists have a lot of the same training, or lack thereof. So for example, let's go back to our Invincible versus My Hero example. Invincible primarily has two artists, co-creator Cory Walker and then Ryan Ottley. There's also a colorist, and that's a whole discussion, but for now, just remember those two names. Now, as far as I can find, neither of these two have any formal training. They didn't go to art school, and I'm not even sure they went to college or university. I could be wrong, but I couldn't find anything that said otherwise. If you look up the creator of My Hero, Kohei Horikoshi, one of the first things on his Wikipedia page is that Horikoshi went to art school. That being said, Horikoshi is kind of an exception, as a lot of artists in both the East and West never go to art school. In the West, a lot of the big artists are self-taught. For example, Brian Lee O'Malley, the creator of the Scott Pilgrim comics. He started college, but he went for film studies, not art studies, and he dropped out. Todd McFarlane, the creator of Spawn and the president of Image Comics. He went to college, but it was on a baseball scholarship, and only seriously started working on comics after he failed to make the team for the Toronto Blue Jays. And there's plenty more artists who never even went to college and started working on comics when they were still teenagers. Now, like I said, you also have a lot of self-taught artists in Japan. Oda was self-taught when he started One Piece. Kubo was self-taught. Araki went to college, but not for art studies, and ultimately dropped out. Akira Toriyama, the creator of Dragon Ball, didn't go to art school. He didn't even go to college. Even Osamu Tezuka, the god of manga, didn't go to art school. He went to Osaka University to study medicine. But like Horikoshi, there's also manga artists that got a formal education early in their careers. Kishimoto, the creator of Naruto, went to art school. Kamome Shirahama, the creator of Witch Hat Atelier, graduated from Tokyo University of the Arts. Kentaro Miura, the creator of Berserk, graduated from Nihon University. So generally speaking, the manga industry tends to see slightly more of a focus on formal education, but that could just be a cultural difference. difference. For the most part, artists in both markets are usually self-taught, deciding to draw these stories as kids and then pursuing those careers as teenagers by studying their favorite stories and then improving on their skills with time and practice. So when we're talking about the training of manga artists and comic book artists, self-education is a major influence. And this explains why comics and manga are becoming more and more similar as the global market evolves. But before I say anything else, make sure to become a channel member if you're enjoying the video. You get custom badges and emojis to show off during our weekly live streams, and you can pick the topic for my next video. But like I was saying, in today's market, the fact of the matter is that comic books and manga have basically the same influences and inspirations. And the more they both evolve, the more they grow together. If you look at artists from the old days, they were inspired by the people in their industry. Comic book artists study other comic book artists, and manga artists study other manga artists. Basically, they learned to draw by studying what they already liked. But as the global market expanded and each economy was more exposed to the other, these influences became more and more common. For example, one of my all-time favorite artists is Joe Mad. Now for years, I always thought of Joe Mad as like the classic comic book style, but in fact, he's commonly cited for his anime art style. And if you look at his work in his original series, Battle Chasers, you can kind of see what people are talking about. But Joe Mad is a big name in comics as well, as he's done a ton of work for Marvel, particularly on the X-Men comics. Now, why would a guy that's such a big part of Marvel draw with more of an anime style? Obviously, this is because that's just what Joe Mad is into. Anime and manga really didn't hit the US until the 80s, so a lot of the big names in the US wouldn't even know what manga was. But today, anime is a global phenomenon and is more accessible than ever. So it's only natural that more and more Western artists are inspired by the stuff out of Japan, because that's the stuff they're into, just as much as they're into Batman and Spider-Man. Now, on the other hand, manga artists do work for comics all the time. So Shirahama, who I mentioned earlier, has done a bunch of work for both Marvel and DC. Yusuke Murata has famously done a ton of promo work for Marvel, particularly for the Spider-Man movies. Horikoshi is of course another big fan of Marvel. There's plenty more artists from both industries that I haven't named that are inspired by both styles, but I'm a novice in the comic world, plus I think you get the idea. The idea is that in this day and age, manga and comics cross over so much and have so many of the same fans that it's becoming harder and harder to distinguish the different styles. Comic book artists study other comic book artists, and manga artists study manga artists. But with most artists relying heavily on self-education, they're mainly influenced by whatever they like. And while it was different in the 60s and 70s, today most people who are playing Marvel Rivals are the same people who are reading One Piece and Jujutsu Kaisen. And if you go to Comic-Con or any convention, there's going to be a lot of people who like Spider-Man just as much as they like Chainsaw Man. So on the one hand, the whole comics versus manga discussion is a bit silly, because besides the different locations and companies, the two share largely the same fans and culture. But on the other hand, obviously the two are different. Of course, art styles and stories are the more obvious differences, but something a lot of people overlook is how comic books are made versus manga. First of all, comic books are in color, which if you only read comics might sound like no duh, but manga is almost always black and white. Like in manga, it's a big deal if your series gets a color page, but comic books are completely in color. In fact, if I decided today that I was going to go get into the X-Men comics, and I found out that a new run was in black and white, I'd be pissed off because it's always been in color and everything else is in color. But that's because there's a different division of labor. In comics, there's a lot more moving parts. With manga, it's typically one artist working for the publisher, aided by a small team of assistants. And for the most part, they have to get that story out every week. But that's it. Obviously, that artist answers to an editor, but the artists basically have full control. In the West, it's a bit different. In the West, you might have someone like Brian Lee O'Malley, who made Scott Pilgrim in black and white by himself. That was because he was basically drawing everything. That's obviously a smaller project. When you get to the big comics like Marvel and DC, it's more systematic. Now, I can't really speak to the specific administrative mechanics because, again, I'm not as familiar with comic books. But for a lot of these DC and Marvel comics, these are series that have been told over and over again for decades. At this point, those companies just have bigger teams. So for example, at Weekly Shonen Jump, they have directors, then editors-in-chief, then junior editors. But that's basically it. Meanwhile, at a company like Marvel, they put out so many different comics that they naturally have bigger editorial teams. Apparently, they even have different teams for, say, the X-Men and the Avengers and so on. I imagine they have a similar structure over at DC as well. So there's more editors involved in comics, or at the very least, there's a larger network of editors. On top of that, there's more division of labor. So again, with manga, it's mostly driven by that main artist. They're writing the story, they're making the characters, and they're doing most of the art. Meanwhile, in comics, there's a different person for everything. So like I mentioned, Invincible has the writer, it has the artists, and then it has a colorist. That's why comics can come out in color, because they have someone who just does all the penciling, and then someone who colors everything in. But there's even more roles, like there can be someone who does all the ink work. There's also letterers, and there's people who do the cover art. So in the world of comics, that's why fans will talk about certain runs of a series, because each run is handled by a different team. Meanwhile, in manga, while they have assistants and editors, those are stories that get one run and are mostly done all by the same person. Therefore, one of the biggest differences when it comes to comics versus manga is how people talk about the artists and how they go about following them. Because if you're a comic book fan, then it's easier to just follow the company and whatever they put out, and you kind of have to go out of your way to follow a particular writer or artist. But if you read manga, everything is done basically by one person. So when you're reading a particular manga, it's easier to gain an appreciation for that particular artist. But that's the upside. The downside is the burnout. Now, burnout is a common issue in any creative field. Animation, video games, content, whatever. But you seem to hear about it more in the realm of anime and manga, especially in manga. There are plenty of manga artists who have literally been hospitalized because they do so much work. Again, this is common in every creative field, and it could be just as common in comics, but you definitely hear about it more in manga. And a big part of that is because in addition to more work placed on single artists, they also have more intense release schedules. With comics, and especially graphic novels, it tends to be monthly releases. You do have comics that come out weekly, but most comics take about a month to make. This is why a lot of people get confused about Radiant, because Radiant is a manga. But unlike Shonen Jump series, new chapters come out maybe once a month. And the reason for this is that Radiant is not a part of a weekly magazine. It's published just like a graphic novel, meaning you only get new prints whenever each volume is complete. So with comics and graphic novels, there's a slower release schedule, but you get more complete prints, and of course, they're almost always in color. With manga, there's series that are monthly or even quarterly, but most series are initially released in print magazines that come out every week. It's only recently that these publishers have started to add to these magazines with digital releases as well. Then you get print volumes every 9 chapters. And that's kind of the trade-off between comics and manga as far as I can tell. In the global market, comics are just more accessible. They're easier to get in print at local stores, and they've been using digital distributors like Comixology for a while now. Manga is becoming much more accessible, but it's harder to get older volumes outside of Japan, and the digital market is still practically brand new. On the other hand, while I'm not familiar with the online culture for comic books, manga's weekly schedule naturally leads to regular discussions of new chapters, which is a big reason why so many new manga become so popular so fast. Now at this point, I've talked a ton about the behind the scenes. I've talked about the artists, the teams, the release schedules and prints, but on its face, especially if you're a casual fan, a lot of that stuff probably doesn't matter. If you're at a comic book store or Barnes & Noble, you might look at the two and think they're basically the same. Or you really might like one and not know much about the other. So of course the natural question is, what's the difference? Or what people really want to know is, Which one is better? Now, while I clearly read more manga than comics, my honest answer is to focus less on the medium and more on the artists. Of course, the first thing everyone brings up is art styles. Now, I kind of talked about this before, but this is another area where I think preconceptions kind of get in the way for a lot of people. Because if you're new to manga, you might think it all just looks like Dragon Ball. Or if you're new to comics, then you might think they're all drawn by Jack Kirby. There are so many different artists, and once you start to actually read this stuff, you'll come to find out that everyone has their own style. Not all comics look the same, and not all manga looks the same. That being said, there's obviously a couple of traits that distinguish the two. So for example, we talked about Spider-Man before. Here is Spider-Man drawn by British artist Jim Chung, and here is Spider-Man drawn by Horikoshi. Now, if we're being honest, maybe hardcore fans could tell the difference, but most people, especially casual fans, probably couldn't tell the difference between the two. Obviously, there's subtle differences like in the shading and line work. If you ask me, Horikoshi uses more detail than most manga artists, but his Spider-Man is somewhat simpler. Chung's, on the other hand, is slightly more detailed, especially with the emphasis on the muscles. And this is really the big difference if you ask me. Manga and comics are both really stylized compared to traditional art, but manga tends to be a bit simpler like Dragon Ball, while comics tend to really emphasize details. And this can be seen outside of manga as well. Some of the best portrayals of Marvel characters come from the classic fighting game Marvel vs. Capcom 2. And since Marvel Rivals has popularized a lot of the female characters, let's use Psylocke as an example. Now, this design is done by an artist named Bengus, and let's compare that to one of Joe Mad's designs for Psylocke. In this case, it's a lot easier to tell which one is comics and which one is supposed to be more anime style. Joe Mad's design is more detailed, whereas Bengus's design is simple and more toned down. That being said, these are two similar artists, both drawing around the same time in the 90s and 2000s, and they likely influenced each other's works. So generally speaking, if you compare something like Invincible to something like My Hero Academia, Invincible is going to seem more detailed, whereas My Hero might seem a bit simpler. But because Horikoshi is so inspired by Western comics, and comic book artists enjoy a lot of anime and manga, there's going to be a lot of crossover. So if you were to ask if comics or manga have better art, there's really no proper answer because it's more a question of the individual artists. Some comic book artists have more of an anime look, and some manga artists draw stuff that looks like it came right out of Marvel or DC. And especially in manga, because each series is controlled by a single artist and not so much a team, you have a lot of different art styles. And this gets to my final point about the styles of writing, because if you want to debate manga versus comics, there's really two ways to go about it. First, you can talk about art, but anyone who reads both will tell you that there's a bunch of crossover. So the only other areas to talk about are writing and companies, which, if you ask me, companies kind of just blends into writing. So before we talked about the editorial teams at Marvel, and some people might not like that idea, but the fact of the matter is that Marvel sells more comic books than anyone else, even more than DC. And they got to that point by crafting popular teams of characters over decades of comic books. Today, that means that all of the Marvel comics are all about the same Marvel characters. But people recognize those characters, and that's why Marvel dominates the market. Manga is different. Maybe if you're Akira Toriyama or Kishimoto, you get a sequel, but you get one run and that's it. You're not getting Jujutsu Kaisen and then Amazing Jujutsu Kaisen and then Jujutsu Kaisen meets My Hero Academia. Manga magazines have their regulars, but they are constantly pumping out new stories every year. And this is what that means. If you want to follow all of the currently running series from Marvel, you do get some variations like sci-fi versus fantasy, but it's all superheroes and it's the same superheroes Marvel has been making since the 80s. Meanwhile, if you want to follow all of the current Shonen Jump manga, you have your regulars like One Piece, but they're making something like 8 brand new series every year. And among those series, you have action series, mystery series, horror series, romance series, and even comedy series. And there's even more variety on the digital app Jump plus. So I can't say that one is better than the other, but when you boil it down, these are the key differences. When it comes to manga, you're getting weekly chapters with specific artists, but while there is more variety, everything is in black and white. When it comes to comics, if you want to get into all of the Marvel comics, it's all in color and it's a bit more detailed, but it's not coming out every week and it's more about the teams rather than any one artist. But that's if you want to get into Marvel. They might dominate the market, but there's also DC, Image Comics, IDW, Dark Horse, and a bunch more. You could read the Transformers comics or the Sonic comics and never touch a single X-Men or Justice League. The same is true for manga. You can read Gachi Akuta or Dandadan and never read a page of One Piece. And that's why when it comes to comics versus manga, it's kind of a silly discussion because they really occupy the same space. Manga and comics have their quirks, but the artists influence each other more and more as the market grows. And no matter what kind of store you go to, the comics and graphic novels are usually right next to the manga. Plus, most of the people who watch Dragon Ball probably started off watching X-Men, and most of the people who are reading One Piece are also reading a bunch of Marvel comics. In this day and age, it's less about comics versus manga and more about individual artists. Comics might be run by teams, but with more accessibility than ever, you can follow the artists you want and pick and choose which comics you want to collect. And manga might get printed in magazines, but almost everyone picks the select few manga they actually want to read. So sure, there's stuff that comic books offer and there's stuff that's really cool about manga, and they both have their own headaches. But if you're a real fan, you probably like both. And if you're a new fan, there's no reason not to check out both. Manga and comics both come from artists who always knew they wanted to draw cool characters, and they both give readers a certain kind of art that they can't find anywhere else. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe comic books and manga are more different than I thought. Which do you prefer? What do you think is the difference? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And don't forget to become a channel member. You'll get badges and emojis, you can pick what I talk about next, and you can even get credited in future videos. Also, check out some of my manga art videos, which you can find in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.